Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for the very lovely Miss Josephine. Yeah, if y'all can see that gentleman right over there. Well, with that in mind, folks, one of the things we like to engage ourselves in these here parts is we love our stories in these here parts. Now, old Mr. Michael over here, he got a little tale he likes to share, and we love every New Year's when he tells this story. Personally, I don't buy into it, but I still like it anyway. Mr. Michael, if you please, why don't you tell us that little tall tale you always share with us every New Year's? Mr. Michael, folks, big round of applause.
First of all, any of you ever heard of a town called Bighorn?
Yeah.
Yes.
You have? Can you tell me where it is? Because I've been looking for it. Folks in Idaho, they don't know about it. They say it's somewhere in Utah. Folks in Utah, they don't know about it. They say it's somewhere in Montana. Folks in Montana tell me I'm a damn fool for even asking. So I think they know something, but they just don't want to talk about it. But I was there. I was there when I was a kid, which is why I can't find it now. My pappy was like Mr. Tanner, and actually more like Mr. Tanner's pappy. He was always one for getting into games, and he did keep us well fed. But I wasn't like Mr. Tanner. I didn't want to follow in his footsteps. I will say that not only was he a good card player, but he had a good eye for when people were pulling a con. And he also, I don't want to say this in a way to cast aspersions, but he had a better sense of when he'd overstayed his welcome than Tanner's pappy, because nobody ever shot him. Maybe they thought about it, but it didn't happen, at least not when I was around. So we moved around a lot was how that worked out. And I liked it when I was a kid, but it got to a point where I really wanted to keep some friends, and wasn't possible under those circumstances. And I remember one night particular when he came and woke me up in the middle of the night. And one of the rules in the family was we always kept a jump bag packed. So he said, okay, grab your kit, we're leaving town. He'd arranged for us to join a wagon train that was heading out of Independence, Missouri, which is where we were living at the time. And we were gonna go follow the Chisholm Trail all the way to Oregon. And as soon as the train set out, Pappy was up to his old tricks, trying to get the other pioneers to get in card games with him. And they was mostly good God-fearing Christian stuff and didn't want anything to do with the cards. And my pappy just wouldn't take no for an answer. And the answer he ultimately got was we was disinvited from continuing with the wagon train. And Pappy, another thing he had in common with Mr. Tanner was he was a bit headstrong. He said, I can find Oregon without it. So we went off north of where the rest of the train was heading. And it's some mighty pretty country out there. We were lucky enough not to run into any Indians. So came to a point we were heading, we could see the foothills of the Rockies in the distance, so we knew we were getting into some interesting territory. We wanted to find shelter before sundown, and the sun was already sinking. And we pushed a little faster than maybe we should have. We caught our wheel between a couple of rocks, and it didn't come out cleanly. We broke one of the spokes, and we couldn't really go fast without ruining the wheel altogether. So I climbed up the hill just in front of us, and just beyond that I saw a plume of smoke, and I said, okay, there's a settlement there, we'll be taken care of. So the oxen pulled, Pappy and I pushed, and we got the wagon just around the hill at the point where the sun went below it, and we found this place. It was a nice little community. They called it bighorn because there were sheep up in the hills, and they were really, really good eating, and they were really dumb too. They were so easy to catch, you could just leave a lasso out hanging from a tree and they'd blunder into it sometimes. So nobody had to work. But the thing was, when we got there, we found they were all busy as beavers, and as they invited us to eat with them, and we allowed as to how we'd help them out, and if they could tell us what we could do to be helpful. So they told us this story. They had a big stadium they was building. There was a fella, he'd been an engineer in the Army during the war, and he'd also been a classical scholar too, go figure. His name was Colonel Dewey, and he designed a wooden version of what he said was the Colosseum in Rome. Okay? But the idea was we were going to, instead of having horse races and gladiatorial contests, whatever those are, we was going to have a prize fight. And the next fellow we met was one of his aides from the Army, a fellow named Sergeant Howe, and he was a boxer. And some of the other fellas told us that they tried to stand up in the ring against him, and nobody could ever lay a glove on him. He was that good. And then the boss of the whole operation was a fellow named Doc Cheatham. And his idea, he knew a bunch of people in the newspaper business, he knew a bunch of people in the sports field, and he had an idea that he said was going to put Bighorn on the map in a big way. The stadium was going to host a prize fight. Sergeant Howe was going to take on a whole bunch of boxers, and we were going to sell tickets to the whole event. And for the climax, he was going to get the great John L. Sullivan, who he figured was the only man alive who could possibly stand 15 rounds against Sergeant Howe. And the contacts he had in the newspapers were writing up articles about how this prize fight was going to happen, and we just heard about this at first, but then we saw it play out. Every week the stagecoach came round from Fort Collins, and they'd bring out a little iron strong box and they'd hand it over to Doc Cheatham. And he'd unlock the strong box with his key, and he'd pull out a whole bunch of envelopes, and he'd wave them around and say, "More tickets sold for the prize fight." And we'd see him sometimes sitting in his office. He'd sit down with a big leather-bound book, and he'd write down all the names of all the ticket purchasers so we'd know when they got here who it was. Meantime, everybody else was building the stadium. And I got to be a fair hand with a hammer, and I could do somewhat on the saw. My pappy was more interested in the brain work behind this. When we were alone, he told me he could sort of tell that there was something funny about Doc Cheatham, and he was following him around trying to figure out what the game was. So we was there for a couple of months, and we saw the stadium get built, and some cabins where the vacationers were going to stay, and a big old trestle table where we were going to have banquets for all of the prize fighters and the fans. And there came a day when we were done with all of that stuff, and they stretched a big yellow ribbon around the gateway into the stadium, and Doc Cheatham made a speech about how this was really going to make Bighorn a tourist destination for years and years to come, make us famous, have picture postcards. And Sergeant Howe talked about how hard he'd been training so he could face John L. in the ring. And then Colonel Dewey came up with a big bronze pair of scissors and cut the ribbon, and we all cheered, and then they had a big old banquet set up for everybody in town. They roasted 12 of those big old sheep, big platters of the squash that grew in the foothills too, steamed to perfection. And there was also a cactus that grew there, and what they'd done with the cactus is they squeezed all the juice out of them, set them out in the sun in big barrels, and by this time they just about fermented to perfection. My pappy didn't hold with drinking, and I still thought of myself as too young, but everybody else got mighty high on that stuff, so I guess it was effective. So everybody eventually went to bed, most of them under their own power. Around about the time the sun came up, I started hearing some noise, and I woke up and I went out the door. The noise was our wagon. And I ran back in and I woke up my pappy and said, "Our wagon's leaving without us. Who do you think could have done it?" And he says, "I know exactly who done it, and I know what the game is now too. It was Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe."
Ladies and gentlemen, big round of applause for Mr. Michael. That story gets better and better every year he tells it. Well done, Mr. Michael. Take a bow. Take a bow. Come on. Big round of applause one more time.